We have a story so surprising that it tangled the best brains of the finest Japanese during World War II. Think of the erection of the entire airfield in 3 days, in the midst of the command of the enemy. What was this secret weapon? What did it do to turn the tide of the war? As we are to discover, it was the genius logistical ruse that left the commanders of the Axis scratching their heads and assisted in altering the status of history. On the 20th day of August, 1942, Henderson Field on Guadalcanal was in complete disorder with US Marine engineers toiling day and night in the face of heavy fire. Shelves were exploding around these courageous men, but they did not give up, and putting down long steel mats of the muddy and riddled coral land, continued their operations. This location was no more than a half-complete Japanese landing field only 2 weeks earlier. Yet, as of this time, American fighter jets were already landing on the newly finished runway. Not only was this airfield changing rapidly and was a marvel of engineering in the face of fire, but it was also a decisive strategic triumph in the Pacific conflict. Japanese officers looked at the unbelievable situation on the hills around with disbelief and frustration. On their part, it would take months of work, heavy machinery, and concrete to build an entirely operational airfield. However, against all odds, the Americans had not only finished this crucial airstrip within a very short 13 days, it was able to achieve this by sheer perseverance and ingenuity, which was largely dependent on the employment of portable steel matting to firm up the loose soil at short notice. The successful fast construction of Henderson Field gave the Allied troops a foothold of utmost importance in the Guadalcanal battle, allowing them to initiate ongoing air operations that would determine the trend of the battle in the Pacific theater. What the Japanese saw was not something that the Japanese had seen before in the battlefield. The Americans had also brought a revolution in terms of engineering of military equipment that defied the traditional methods of construction. The U.S. Army did not need to import huge amounts of concrete or use huge construction equipment to construct airstrips. Instead, they used a highly effective invention called the pierced steel planking innovation. They were substantially large interlocked sheets of perforated metal which could be thrown over the ground like colossal steel carpets. An airstrip could be assembled within a very small period of time once the engineers rolled them out and assembled the sections together. It was quick, convenient, and could be completed with much less resources as compared to the conventional building. Such an idea appeared to be impossible to many observers, particularly the people of Germany and Japan. Airfields were used to them as large-scale engineering ventures which took weeks or months of hard work. The Americans, on the other hand, were of a different opinion. They could make their own runways anywhere with their portable steel planking. Planes were now able to take off and land on surfaces once thought unsuitable. The soft coral islands, muddy grounds which became swamps during rainfall, and even unstable volcanic ash which could not have been effectively held down by any other substance. This was a simple but brilliant technology which totally changed the logistics of air operations so that the U.S. was able to afford to project air power within a short and flexible time in the Pacific and even farther. The determining factor in the war was airfields. Their ability to control them equated to control of the skies, and in the current wars, air superiority could be the deciding factor in the success of a complete war. In each of the participating countries, this was a vital reality, but few of them realized it as the Americans did. To ground forces, an airfield was not merely a piece of ground with runways. It was the supply line, reconnaissance, and air control which could change the battle line. The Germans and the Japanese were convinced that the Americans must go through prolonged and tedious campaigns to capture every airstrip that was occupied by the enemy. Their tactical plan was excellent on paper. By destroying their own airfields in retaliation, they would leave the advancing Americans with no bases to use and would have to spend months to recover and start anew. This, in their mind, would delay the drive across Europe and across the Pacific and would buy them the much-needed time to reorganize. However, they underestimated the ingenuity and the persistence of the US military. The Seabees and American engineers soon demonstrated that there was no destroyed runway which could long stop them. Through incredible ingenuity, they were able to fix or build airfields at an alarming rate, sometimes in a matter of days and not months. The same plan, which was to hold them in check, only gave them impulse and showed that the real driving force of air domination was not in the mere possession, but in the unconquerable power of reorganization and adaptation quicker than the devastator, which was accompanied in its turn. These steel mats can be traced to the United States, where a creative engineer by the name of Gerald Gruch started to come up with new concepts of portable runways. His interest had been in coming up with some steel panels that were not heavy, such that they could be managed by few men, but those that were strong enough to support the severe loads of military aircrafts. In this regard, he designed the panels with a sequence of holes which were punched on the panel, and this made them lighter but still strong. A clever lock-making system so designed that every piece might be fitted in with the next formed a stable surface which may be extended in any degree desired. It was a very simple, but at the same time groundbreaking idea, as the supply of prefabricated panels would be transported to a distant site, then connected to one another, and you would have a fully functional airstrip in not so long, without the need of heavy equipment or concrete. In 1939, extensive military experimentation commenced to determine the suitability of the design by Gruch to work in a real-life scenario. The steel mats were beyond the expectation, as they were capable of supporting the huge weight of the heaviest bombers of the war. They fought mud, rain, and heat and freezing climate and never gave up on their grip on the ground. They were as soon useful in front bases and in swiftly moving battlefronts due to their power and versatility. Their convenience of installation was perhaps their most impressive aspect. Engineers could build a complete runway 5,000 feet long, using only hand tools and a small crew of men in a bit more than a week. This discovery would in the near future be critical in the growth of air activities in the war, as the planes could be in practically any part of the world. The technology was first tested in the very harsh conditions like the Greenland, where the conditions were unforgiving and demanding, leading to the first successful application of this innovative technology. Nevertheless, its real utility was discovered in the Pacific theater of the World War II, especially on islands, where the topography was nothing more than mud, coral, or sand, and the construction of a traditional airfield appeared to be impossible. By 1943, the U.S. factories had increased production to an extent that they were producing enough prefabricated steel panels every month to pave whole airfields. These panels were loaded on the cargo ships and in some instances on aircraft to serve the purpose of rapidly building airstrips the instant Allied troops landed. At Guadalcanal, engineers labored day and night, and the enemy was subjecting them to constant fire, and yet they managed to lay out 500 steel panels in an hour. The runway, though there were difficult weather conditions such as heavy rain, was still open, a feat which the Japanese forces did not believe that it could do in such a situation. This effective plan was repeated on other occasions when the U.S. fighter planes were using airstrips that had been built in just a few days after landing, like in the Battle of Tarawa. This enabled air operations to be sustained with success in the Pacific campaign, being dependent on the rapid deployment of airfields. A military runway would be a tedious task that might require half a year of work, equipment, and supply before its construction, before the invention of portable steel mats. Each strip was to be neatly leveled, surfaced, and strengthened prior to the weight of military bombers and fighters being placed on it. However, when prefabricated steel planking was introduced, the U.S. military transformed this whole process. The mats were easily prepared and put in place and linked together to make rough or uneven ground a completely functioning airstrip within days only. It is not surprising that both the Japanese and German intelligence could hardly believe how American air bases appeared, at night having never appeared before. The U.S. crews would just put in new individual panels when enemy bombs would destroy parts of a runway rather than rework them all and bring it back to operational readiness in a few hours. Portable runways made of steel and designed in this system provided troops of the U.S. with one of the most tremendous logistical advantages in the war. Whole fields might be moved, extended, or reconstructed as the war swung back and forth between islands in the Pacific. A runway may be extended when needed with additional panels, and this would enable it to handle bigger aircrafts or heavier bombing operations. Even the uneven ground, which would have been an obstacle, like sandy beaches or swampy soil, was not a hitch. The mats made of steel were very strong and stable to the extent that American engineers could establish air bases anywhere, as long as there was strategic necessity to do so. These mobile landing fields represented speed, flexibility, and innovative construction in many aspects, and contributed to keeping the U.S. military operations all over the world. These runways were built by men who were entrepreneurs in the real meaning of the word. They were not merely engineers, but soldiers who encountered the same risks as those of the men on the firing line, and who did hard work, backbreaking work. And of the engineering battalions, it was a common practice that members of those companies toiled day and night, working without a pause, even when enemy shells were bursting right around them. They also, in most instances, fought directly in the process of firefights, clad in their battle outfits, operating bulldozers, graders, and in a few instances, they would make the giant machines a makeshift shield to the oncoming fire. One of the most outstanding examples was the 1892nd Engineer Aviation Battalion that was composed of African Americans, and its bravery was constantly put into the challenge during the fighting. They suffered battle losses as they continued to advance with their task building of vital airfields in places that were still considered as threatened by the enemy. Each of their new airfields was much more than a piece of cleared ground. It was a lifeline which stretched American air strength across the battlefield, and in many cases, the planes were able to take off only a few days after coming down on the ground. Now and again, U.S. engineers could finish airstrips far in advance of allotment time, at other times, frighteningly in advance, and the enemy could not be warned at all. The Axis commanders were barely in a position to imagine how the Americans had been able to establish fully equipped air bases within such a short period of time. All these fast-built structures succeeded in breaking the defensive anticipation of the enemy, and they were compelled to make improvisations at military speed. And on the defensive side, which were desperate, this clever technology came in handy in many other theaters besides the Pacific. Portable steel mats were used, and this brought an absolute change in the way the Allied forces were fighting on the ground and also reaching some of the least accommodating venues of the war. These mats offered the stable landing grounds in the heat of the deserts in North Africa, where the soft sand would have rendered the flying operations impossible. The rough and difficult Italian soil provided them with a dependable landing and takeoff area in the more than 2,000 miles of advancing troops. Steel matting proved essential to take part in the Allied air operations, and even on the beaches at Normandy after the invasion, it was necessary to have U.S. and British aircraft carving temporary airstrips just behind the front lines at any time or place they were required. This proved to be a major advantage to the Allies, as their planes could fly near the battlefield and continually press the enemy units. American industry manufactured these steel mats on a mass scale between the year 1942 and 1945. To produce approximately 1,000 miles of portable runway, factories in the United States produced them in large quantities, making it an enormous industrial accomplishment during a period of international war. The panels themselves were made by each panel at a very low cost of only a few dollars, and much less than permanent concrete airfields would have cost. The mats also were of unparalleled utility, besides being cost-effective. They could be knocked down and repacked, unlike heavy cement strips, with the movement of the war front. This mobility ensured that the air support could follow the forwarding armies nearly as quickly as them, thus giving their movement the mobility and rapidity of speed, as well as strategic capability to the Allied offensive on various continents. After the end of the World War II, the steel matting acquired a life-saving importance, which is much more than the military one. It was necessary during the important post-war actions like the Berlin airlift, when it helped to quickly create airstrips needed to supply the besieged city. Other later wars, such as the Korean and Vietnam Wars, also relied greatly on the matting, which allowed the quick building of solid runways and working bases in difficult terrain. Although more modern times have passed, steel mats are still used in the military and civilian construction projects as a reliable and efficient means of ground support where groundwork is not practical or efficient enough to be put into place. This shows the timeless quality of such innovations in logistics over decades of diverse utilization. The overlay meaning of the steel matting is not that it was a weapon of war, but that it was able to sustain and improve mobility, connectivity, and the development of infrastructures at the most important times in history. Instead of being rejoiced in its destruction, it was used as a mode of construction, filling the gaps, facilitating the movement, these factors that tend to define the success of any military operation and humanitarian intervention, whether one or the other. The most important thing that this history has taught me is that battlefields cannot be won by laying more firepower or technology, but mainly it is the capacity to maintain the logistics. The ability to supply, deploy resources, and even build needed infrastructure more quickly and effectively than the opponent is often critical. Steel matting did not often feature on the front pages, but it laid the fundamental groundwork of determining air superiority and operational preparedness in the world, and quietly made possible the ability of air forces to exert influence and accomplish their aims. Now, when you next consider the great duels of the World War II, be sure to recall the silent resourcefulness which secured the triumph. Not only the tanks and the planes, but the engineers who made roads and runways where there existed nothing but jungle or sand or mud, and to keep receiving unexpected history, like that button, comment, and enjoy more stories about the invention of wartime, and what, in your opinion, were the most surprising inventions in history. Thanks to you, and I will see you in the next one.